Hey everyone, welcome back to Plain Clothes Faith. I'm Nick, and I'm really glad you're here. In the last episode, we talked about what happens when the life doesn't go the way we planned, when the story unfolds differently than we expected. We looked at the disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. In that moment, they said something that perfectly captured their disappointment in 24:21. We had hope that he was the one to redeem Israel. Those words reveal something deeply human. The disciples believed that they understood how the story was supposed to unfold, but their expectations had collapsed. What they didn't yet realize was that the resurrection had already happened. The story wasn't broken, they were simply standing in the middle of it. And that leads us to another challenge that many believers eventually face. Sometimes the story isn't wrong, sometimes the story is simply moving more slowly than we expected. You pray about something, you step forward in faith, you believe God is leading you somewhere, and then nothing seems to happen. Days turn into months, months turn into years, and eventually a quiet question begins to surface as the story stalls. But when we look carefully at Scripture, we begin to notice it's something important. God often works on a timeline very different from our own. Promises are given, faith is required, but the fulfillment often arrives far later than anyone expected. And because of that, Christians throughout history have spent a great deal of time reflecting on the relationship between faith and time. In fact, one of the earliest voices to think deeply about this was the 4th century theologian Augustine. He lived during a time when the early church was still wrestling with how to understand God's grace and the unfolding story of history. Much of his writing reflected on the way that God works patiently through time, often slowly and often in ways that people cannot immediately see. In fact, in that vein, once wrote, "Trust the past to the mercy of God, the present to his love, and the future to his providence." End quote. Augustine understood something that many believers eventually learned. Looking backward is easier. With time, we begin to see how God was working. But the future is where uncertainty lives. The future is where waiting happens. And trusting God with time is often the hardest part of faith. Centuries later, during the upheaval of the Protestant Reformation, another voice reflected the same theme. That voice is the 16th century reformer, John Calvin. Calvin spent much of his life teaching believers about the sovereignty of God, the truth that God actively governs the unfolding story of the world. In his Institutes, he wrote this: "Except what is knowingly and willingly decreed by him." For Calvin, that meant something special. God's providence governs not only the outcomes of our lives, it governs their timing as well. Delays in the story are not signs that God has forgotten his promises. Often, they are the places where faith grows deeper and trust becomes stronger. Long before Calvin, another theologian wrestled with that tension, and that was 13th century scholar Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas had devoted his life to exploring the relationship between faith and human understanding. And at one point, he wrote, "To the one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. And to the one without faith, no explanation is sufficient." Faith does not mean we suddenly understand everything God is doing. Faith means trusting the character of God, even when the chapter we're living in feels confusing. And for some theologians, we see these reflections were written in books, monasteries, and classrooms. But for others, they were lived out. And one of the clearest examples of lived out theology is the 20th century pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. During World War II, Bonhoeffer openly resisted the Nazi regime, and eventually he was imprisoned because of it. And from prison, he wrote these words: "God does not give us everything we want, but he does fulfill his promises, leading us along the best and straightest paths to himself." Bonhoeffer understood from experience that God's purposes often unfold through circumstances that we would have never chosen ourselves. In fact, another Christian writer helped bring these ideas into everyday language. The 20th century author C.S. Lewis once wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. Difficult seasons have a way of slowing the story down." And when we turn to Scripture, we discover something surprising. Many of the people God used most spent long seasons waiting. One of the clearest is Abraham. Abraham's story begins with a promise. At the time, he and his wife Sarah had no children. Years had already passed without the family that God had promised. And yet, in the middle of that uncertainty, God spoke in Genesis 15:5 and said this: "Look toward the heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them, so shall your offspring be. It was an extraordinary promise, but the years kept passing. Eventually, the tension between the promise and reality became difficult to live with. So Abraham and Sarah tried to move the story forward themselves. In Genesis 16, verse 2, and Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai in verse. Now remember, Sarah had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. And when Abraham went into Hagar, through that union, a son was born. That son, remember, was not the promised son that God spoke of. They had tried to make the promise happen on their own timeline, not because they stopped believing, but because the waiting had become painful. And if we're honest, many of us recognize that impulse. When the story moves slowly, we try to manage the outcome ourselves. But after 25 years, the promise was finally fulfilled that God promised Abraham in Genesis 21, verses 1 and 2. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him in verse. Now remember, that son was Isaac, and Isaac was born not when Abraham expected, but not when Sarah expected either, but exactly when God intended. Now, Joseph experienced a different kind of waiting. His story began with betrayal, sold into slavery by his own brothers. And then, once it seemed like he was finally rising above it, he gets falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and eventually imprisoned because of it. Now, while Joseph was in prison, two officials from Pharaoh's court were confined there with him. One of them was Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, and Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dream and told him that he would soon be restored to Pharaoh's service. And the only thing that Joseph asked in payment was to remember him when he was restored. And when that happened, it must have seemed like the moment the story would finally move forward. But scripture records a small sentence that captures the moment perfectly in Genesis 40, verse 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And Joseph remained there, still waiting. Joseph's story reminds us that sometimes waiting comes through setbacks, moments when it seems like the story might finally move forward, only to stall again. But Joseph's story is not the only place we see that pattern. Another example appears in the life of David. When David was young, the prophet Samuel anointed him as the future king of Israel in 1 Samuel 16:13. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. In verse. But after being anointed, David went back to tending sheep. The promise had been given, but the fulfillment of that promise was still very far away. And as time passed, Saul became jealous of David. David spent years running for his life, and at one point, Saul entered the very cave where David was hiding. David had the opportunity to force the story forward and take the throne by force. And even his men encouraged him to take this throne by force. But in 1 Samuel 24:6, we see something amazing. David refused to move the story forward by force. He said, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him. And David refused because David understood something that many believers eventually learn. Even when the opportunity appears to force the story forward, the timing still belongs to God. And years later, the promise was fulfilled in 2 Samuel 5, verse 4. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. Abraham waited for the promise to begin. Joseph waited through setbacks. David waited for the promise to be fulfilled. Different stories, same pattern. God gives the promise, the story becomes difficult, and then fulfillment arrives later than expected. And if we're honest, this is where their stories intersect with ours. Because most of us don't struggle with trusting God after the story is finished. We struggle in the middle chapters when the outcome is unclear, when the promise still feels distant, and when the story moves slower than we hoped. And in those moments, our instinct is often the same as Abraham's. We try to move the story forward, but scripture shows us a different path. Faithfulness. Joseph remained faithful in prison. David remained faithful while he was running. And Abraham eventually learned to trust the promise instead of trying to manufacture the outcome. So here's a simple challenge for this week. Think about one area of your where the story feels like it's moving too slowly. Instead of trying to force the story forward, ask a different question. God, what does faithfulness look like in this chapter? Not 5 steps ahead, just the next one. And then take that step with patience and trust God. Because the God who makes promises is also the God who keeps them. And in the next episode, we're going to continue this conversation about the middle chapters of faith, because knowing the story is slow is one thing. Living faithfully in those slow seasons is something else. How do we stay hopeful when progress feels invisible? How do we keep trusting God when the story still hasn't changed? Thanks for walking with me on Plainclothes Faith. No hype, no shortcuts, just faithful steps one day at a time. And hopefully, I'll see you next week.